Hello, everyone. In this lecture, we will be discussing the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So, a small introduction about the author. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in the year 1860. She was an American writer. She was also part of the women's movement in the United States. Now, why her biography is important while analyzing and understanding the short story is because we can see certain comparisons, or we can see certain association with the character and our author. So, Charlotte Perkins Gilman also was suffering from postpartum psychosis, like our narrator in the short story. So, she was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis in the year 1885. And uh, she, like other women during that time, was asked to completely rest, do nothing about it, and but she couldn't find any solution to it while she was following the idea of rest cure. And later she was able to overcome this condition. But later, while, let's say, when she was 75 years old, she was diagnosed with cancer. For nearly again 3 to 4 months, she underwent treatment for it, but it did not prove effective. And because of all the pain and suffering that she was enduring, she decided to take her life. So, while she committed suicide after her death, a note was found, and quite strangely, in that note, she had written, "I have preferred chloroform to cancer." So, she committed suicide by taking chloroform. So that is why this note, it was something that was found near to her. So we can understand that how she viewed her life from this particular statement. She was too tired of suffering from cancer. That is the idea we get from this note that was left behind by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Now, about this particular story, it was published in the year 1891 in the New England magazine. Like I mentioned, it has autobiographical, semi autobiographical elements. We find it in this short story. It's a first person narrative. Now, this story, uh, it is written in the form of a journal entry or a diary entry. So you can find that there are different entries, different journal entries, and all these entries are put together to to become a story. So there are certain entries where there is an abrupt beginning, some stories have abrupt ending. So it is quite interesting to see how we get an understanding of the narrator, her life from a first person perspective, and from, let's say, like diary entries. Now when we look at this journal entry, we can also, let's say, assume that these are certain entries from her own journal. We can make an assumption here that maybe Gilman also wrote journal entries, and these might be entries from her own journal. We can make such kind of assumption over here. Now, something else interesting about this story is that we get an understanding of the situation of women during that particular period of time. Let's say the late 19th century and the early 20th century. How women, there was no proper treatment to women suffering from these kind of conditions. And one uh, particular example that I would like to point out here is that, like I mentioned in the introduction to Gilman, she herself was suffering from postpartum psychosis. And it is mentioned that she met one of the popular physicians of that time. He was the most popular person in the country at that particular point of time, and it is Dr. Silas Way. So this name is mentioned in the story that we are discussing as well. So she met with this doctor, and he had asked her to take complete rest. This is where the idea of rest cure comes in. That is something very common that physicians used to ask women to go through. Like, let's say, they are not supposed to do anything, they are not supposed to work. In the case of Gilman, she was asked to not write anything, completely lie down on bed, take rest. That is the idea of rest cure. So, for nearly 3 months, she followed the instructions of Dr. Silas, but it proved it was not effective for her. Her condition worsened, and that is when she decided to let's say, go with another alternative. She herself decided to stop this practice of rest cure, and she started writing, and that completely changed her life. That brought back happiness. She was able to be happy in small things while she was engaging in the act of writing. So this idea of rest cure was proved completely wrong by Gilman. And later she also met with Dr. Mary Putnam. She is one of the first females to be admitted for medicine in the University of Paris. So she somehow got in touch with Dr. Mary Putnam, and she was able to, let's say, give a proper diagnosis and cure to Gilman, proper cure from this condition. And when we talk about the reception of this short story, there were many people who were not happy about the narrative or the story of Yellow Wallpaper, especially physicians like Dr. Silas. Gilman herself states that, when people got to know the story, there were people who were so furious that she was trying to put in wrong ideas into the minds of people. That is how some people have stated about this work. So that made her quite upset. But then she says that she is like the character in the story. She also had to go through the same situation, but somehow she was able to overcome it. And that is when she says, the statement is from one of her writings. It was not intended to drive people crazy. So she's talking about this short story. People accused her for writing a short story that would drive people crazy when they read it. So she is saying that no, that was not my intention, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked. So there were another group of people who appreciated her for openly talking about the condition that she was going through. So she is an example, or we can consider her as a perfect example to prove that the idea of rest cure does not work. And like I mentioned, in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, women were considered to suffer from hysteria, or, like I mentioned, postpartum psychosis. And it was only the women who suffered from this. That was the thought that the psychoanalyst had. Only women suffer because they have a womb, or they have, let's say, hormones. So it is only the women who suffer from these kind of conditions like hysteria, and it is not the men, hysteria or depression. So but the people treating these women were men, and they had limited knowledge of what was happening in a woman's body. So that is the irony of it. And that is when they asked women to take complete rest and all, the idea of rest cure, like I mentioned. But Gilman stands as a perfect example for the failure of this method of rest cure. Now, while discussing this short story, while discussing the idea of rescue and all the other points related to the short story, it is also important to discuss the term, German term unheimlich, or it also means uncanny in English. So we are borrowing this idea from Sigmund Freud's essay, The Uncanny, the English translation, which came out in the year 1919. Now, what is uncanny or unhinged? It is a feeling of airy familiarity mixed with discomfort or unease. So he says that, Freud says that when we look at certain things which are there in our day to day life, he gives an example of a doll, or now let's say a book or something like that. We see it every day, but all of a sudden there is a sudden strangeness to it, something unfamiliar about it, something depressing about it, something that invokes anxiety. So, this is what he calls as uncanny. And in this short story, you can see that the yellow wallpaper is an example of uncanny. And all the other characters, when they look at this yellow wallpaper, they don't find anything strange about it. But for our narrator, she sees that, she feels that there is someone inside the wallpaper, someone who is trying to free herself from the wallpaper. So this is an example of uncanny.